Nice to see you all again, hopefully. This is kind of the second webinar in the installments that I have been able to be a part of. And today we're going to build on the first webinar, which was the engage phase. We're going to move on to the second phase, which is investigate. And we're going to learn more about what students are doing and how you can kind of facilitate that work for them and keep the guardrails up, so to speak. So like I said, the engage phase, which was the previous phase to this, is really all about helping students contextualize, right? To personalize problems in their community, to identify what kind of problems they want to solve and who they can reach out to learn more about them and why they're important to solve. The investigate phase is really where they start to learn about those problems more deeply. And they do that through a couple of ways, and we'll talk about that here today. So they're going to be identifying the kind of questions that they need to ask to learn more about the challenge that they want to solve. They're going to actually participate in some activities to get the answers to those questions, and then they're going to start making plans on how to act on what they've learned. So it follows the engage phase after the students have identified and are ready to learn more about their challenges. So you can really think of like the demarcation point, the point at which you want to begin the investigate phase is when your students have an actionable challenge that they are ready to begin working on. So they don't have solutions yet, but they have a call to actions they're ready to build on. So during the investigate phase of the challenge-based learning process, your students are going to identify guiding questions. So guiding questions are what they need to know or what they need to know how to do in order to solve the challenge. And they're going to use resources and activities to answer those questions. And they're going to start building a plan to act on the things that they've learned. So we can talk a little bit about guiding questions. So guiding questions are actually student generated. I think I want to make that point first. You as a facilitator, as a educator facilitator, can help them create these guiding questions. I think what I would promote you doing is working with students to generate questions as opposed to coming up with the questions for them. So the guiding questions point towards the knowledge that the students will need to develop solutions. And it's also important to note that they don't only happen in this one process, right? So you can imagine like kind of the design process. As you build and test and learn things, new questions begin to emerge. So one way to think about guiding questions is to kind of just keep like a running tally of what questions you're asking and what answers that you find. And there are scaffolding materials for that in the resources and the Ciena Challenge website. So building on the example we actually used in the previous webinar, our example challenge that we came to was how can we make it safer for the elderly to live at home alone? And so we might need to generate some guiding questions about that, right? So you can imagine students have gone out into the community, they've talked to their family members, they've talked to people in the school, and they know that it's an issue that the elderly live at home alone. They have a lot of safety calls for them, right? So the question, the next part is really figuring out like, why does that happen? What's going on there, right? It's the investigation of that challenge. And so some of the guiding questions you might expect students to ask are things like, what are the dangers of living alone? So if I want to know how to make it safer for elderly folks to live at home alone, I want to know what dangers they potentially face. We also might want to know like what kind of housing exists in our community to give us a better sense of like why it might be unsafe for them to live alone. Is there something about the housing? And then there's also like what effects of aging, like what about being an elderly person impacts their independence? What is harder for them to do, right? And so these are, as I've written them here, written in like adult language, right? So like these are questions that I came up with, but you can imagine similar questions, but being written at a student's level. So that's the other thing to think about is scaffolding your students to get to the answers that they want through questions, but helping them write it in their own voice, in their own language. And so once you have a set of questions that you think are suitable for you to begin like answering, then you need a way to answer them, right? And the way that we think about that is we call them guiding activities and resources. So, pardon me. So these are used by the students to answer those questions. And so the thing to note here is that this isn't all student driven, most likely. So it's not always going to be the case that a student knows exactly how to answer a question. And this is where you as a facilitator need to step in and help guide them. So it's also a really good opportunity for you to do some connection between content that you or your school district or your community think is important, right? So asking questions that are related to, say, like mathematics content or social studies content, or even I saw social entrepreneurship in the chat, which I think is really awesome, right? Like, how can some of the resources that you're providing kids at this point to answer their questions, how can that support your content, as you have kids, if they're in a more traditional education setting. So you can imagine, if I have a question, I need a way to actually investigate and experience that question so that I can answer it. And this is where the guiding activities and resources come in. Some can be student created and student driven, and some can also be created by you and really support students in places where their knowledge gaps are going to exist. I think one of the struggles with really focusing on student driven learning is this idea that, like, our students don't actually know this stuff yet, so they don't know what to do next. And that's where you can kind of step in. You give students the agency to ask the questions and to realize where their own knowledge gaps are. And you can step in at that point and say, oh, I have a resource for that. Why don't we think about doing X, Y, or Z, right? So that's a really a way to think about facilitating learning that's really student driven and is focused on student agency, is to fill in the knowledge gaps where they have identified that they exist. And so some of the ways that we might answer these guiding questions, if we think about the elderly folks living at home alone and it being unsafe and us wanting to try to solve that challenge, we asked what are the major dangers of living alone? What we might do then is actually go out into the community and ask a community member about it. We might go to a person who lives alone and say, tell me more about, like, what struggles you have day to day. We might go to the local council on aging, right? People who help out seniors in the community, and talk to them about it and say, what are you seeing out in the world that makes it hard for senior citizens when they don't have a big support system? And then things like, what are the effects of aging on a person's independence? I mean, could be more of a medical question that might actually be answered through a more traditional research project, right? So we can send kids online to conduct some research. They can learn from online resources, or even textbooks in that case, if we had some that would support it, in a more traditional learning style environment to answer that question. So you can see that there is, another question here, like, what kind of housing exists in my community? You can conduct field research. That just means going out into the field and learning about what's out there. So you can see that there's really like 3 different potential ways here that you could answer these questions, right? One might be more ethnographic in nature by interviewing people. One might be really field related, which is like going out and experiencing the world and doing research that way. And another one might be more traditional, which is like leaning on knowledge sources that already exist to improve your knowledge base. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about a couple of submissions from the previous round of Ciena, so Ciena 22, that I thought were really insightful and use the guiding questions process really, really well. And just a note that you can actually access these things on the Ciena Solutions Challenge website. So you'll see there is a gallery and resources for educators. And if you go to the gallery, you'll see the projects are here, and you can look at these projects. And so this project is right here. It is Confronting Indigenous Poverty. And so you can open that up and it talks to you. You can download their submission. You can look at their sustainable development goals, and it just kind of gives you an overview there. And so at Ridgemont High School in Ottawa, Canada, they wanted to learn more about confronting Indigenous poverty. And so they have this essential question that they're working to answer, right? And that pushes their challenge forward. Why is the Indigenous community still living in poverty? And so what they did was come up with some guiding questions that were really key and essential to their learning. And so if you look at their submission, they lined these questions out and talk about how they answered them. And I thought for people who might be planning to submit in this following year, this is a really powerful thing to do, to lay out student thinking in that way, to show like, what challenge did they want to solve? What questions did they actually ask and feel like they wanted answered? And how did they get the answers to that? Those things are going to illustrate student learning in a really powerful way, and would love to see those in new submissions that come in. So this school, Ridgemont High School, wanted to know, where do people in the First Nations get their income from? They wanted to know what local supports exist for them, and they wanted to know what role the government played in actually helping these people. And so what they did is they actually went out and answered these questions in a certain set of ways. So the first question, where do they get their income from? They could answer with research, right? So they could look on government websites. They could do some research and figure out, where does income come from for First Nation people? What local supports do First Nation people have? They actually went into the First Nations community and interviewed somebody there and learned about what supports they have. And then trying to understand how the government helped, again, they went into the research world. They did some reading, they found some resources to help them understand how the government was involved in that process. And so I did also want to highlight another submission from Ciena 22 that I thought was really powerful because it illustrates student thinking really clearly. And this one is called Yugma. And so this was the City Pride School in Pune, India. And so their essential question was, how do we integrate specially abled children into the mainstream? So they had a school close to them that was providing services to students with special needs. And so they were really interested in these students were on how to integrate them into mainstream schooling and activities. And so for them, they had a few essential questions that were really interesting to me. One, they wanted to get a deeper understanding of how students and the disabilities that those students have affect their lives. Like, how does it affect their schooling and their lives, and how does it impact their day-to-day? They also wanted to better understand, how much do these disabilities that students have, how much are they reliant on other people for assistance? So what level of independence did they have, depending on what disability that they might be facing? And so for them, the other context that was really, really important was, what tools specifically exist for Indian students? Because for them, what they realized, I think, along the way, was that a lot of the tools that are developed to support these students aren't specifically focused on Indian students, either in language or culture. And so those are things that they wanted to understand. Are there tools that specifically exist to support students from our own cultural background? And so the way that they went and learned about these things, so to learn about how disabilities affected their lives, they actually went to the school and just interacted with these students and talked to them and kind of did informal interviews and just kind of hung out with them and tried to learn more about their specific needs, about their specific barriers and things like that. So the other thing that they did that was really interesting, is a little bit different than our previous example, is when they wanted to learn how reliant they were on other people for assistance, they actually sent out a survey. So the students developed a survey and sent it out to the school and the people there, and tried to learn about like exactly how much support they needed from other people, external support, to go about their day-to-day activities. And then they went and tried to look at assistive tools to see, like, are these specifically targeted towards people in India? Or are they just, things that are written in English or Spanish, right? And that can't really support our students who maybe don't speak those languages. And so, yet again, another example of how the students came up with really interesting questions, and they answered them in a variety of ways. And you can imagine, right, these students didn't develop the survey just all on their own. Their educator facilitator stepped in and helped them design that survey in a way that was both usable, so that other people could access it and respond to it, but they help them understand the results too. So skill building through the investigation process. Okay, so one thing that I do want to point out is that synthesis is an extremely important part of the investigate phase. So you might have students working on the investigate phase for any number of like days, weeks, even months, right? Depending on how many really important and in-depth questions that you have to answer. And so what you need to make sure that you take time to do is actually synthesize all of the learnings along the way. So every time that you participate in an activity to answer a question, you should be documenting that in some way. And at the end, synthesizing it all so that it really prompts you into action. And so if you go to the resources tab on the Ciena Solutions Challenge website, which you can find resources for educators in here at the resource library, you'll find that there are investigation synthesis documents. And so these will help scaffold both you and your students into making sure that they aren't just answering a million questions, but not taking knowledge away from it. So I think the goal here is not just answer as many questions as possible or tick them off the list. It's really think deeply about the what comes out of your investigation. And so the other thing that you have access to on the Ciena Solutions resource page is all of these investigation methods. So these are all lined out in that resource page that in a way that actually will help students go out into the world and answer these questions, or will help you in planning to help your students do these things. So I'll give you the brief list here: analyzing data sets, collecting data and using computational models, conducting surveys, doing experiments, doing field research or online research, looking back. This is an interesting one: critiquing prior solutions. There are lots of times where students are going to identify challenges that other people have already tried to solve, but maybe have failed. And so critiquing that prior solution to this challenge might actually be a really powerful thing for them to engage in, right? They might find, if we use our elderly people living at home example, they might find that when they go to the local council on aging, they're like, yeah, well, we tried to do this thing for them. We put out a document about safety features, but it's not that, I don't know, it hasn't stopped anything. That's a really actual powerful thing for students to learn and to learn from, right? So maybe they can dig into that prior potential solution and figure out, where did it go wrong? Why isn't it actually doing the things they want it to do? Other investigation methods includes things like interviews, learning about similar communities, looking across the world. So, you know, those kids, those Yugma students might look at other communities in India. They could look at other communities in different countries and say, like, who else is facing a similar problem and what are they doing about it? You can use primary sources, right? We can point kids towards curriculum if we feel like that is something that we can do at this point. We can say, like, hey, there is a really interesting chapter, like a discussion about how aging happens in human beings in this biology textbook. So let's go there and see what we can learn from it. Other things you might do are take virtual field trips. You might actually go to a talk, right? You might find that there is a a community member or a talk happening locally that you can take your students to learn more about things. So the other note here is that this is a long list, but it's not exhaustive. There are lots of things that you might do with students that aren't on this list, and that's totally fine too. And so I did want to, again, point you to a couple of these resources, or at least on the website, how to get to them. So you can go to that resource library on the Ciena Solutions website and at least start looking at these things and think about how you might use them as your students work to, identify and investigate and act on their challenges. Right. So if you look at activities for students on that website, you'll see the investigation methods. So this is where you can click on these and it will actually give you access to the documents that will have these investigation methods in there. And I know Chris has been dropping them in the chat as well. So feel free to go ahead and check those out. And so again, I did also want to mention that when you get to the resources webpage, you can filter by language on the left-hand side and resource type. So I did want to bring that up as well. And Carissa, remind me, it's the facilitator's guide that is in multiple languages now, I believe, yes?
Yes. So the facilitator's guide, let me double check that to be sure. The facilitator's guide is in English, Spanish, and French. And it is also, let me make sure, It is not in other languages yet, but the resource library, excuse me, the challenge builder, the project portfolio template, and the project submission and sustainability awards form, those are in Portuguese, Russian, Korean, Chinese, and Arabic. So we haven't completely moved the facilitator's guide over in other languages yet, but we're working on that.
Great. Yeah. So I just wanted to highlight that there are multiple languages available to you. So please check that out in your language of choice. Okay. So the other thing that I did want to call out too is that if you are in a more traditional learning setting, so some of you folks are going to be, you might be librarians, or you might be running an after-school program. Some of you might be actual classroom teachers, right? And so if and when you have things that you specifically want students to learn, you want to guide them toward, you can actually use these investigation methods to meet things like standards, right? So if you were in a standards-based learning environment and your students need to learn how to factor polynomials, right? You can actually point to that content through helping them choose investigation methods that will get there, whether that's things like using primary sources or using numbers to compute things. So if you were interested, for example, on really focusing on computational thinking with your students and helping them like build that skill set up, you might have them really key in on a few investigation methods, particularly analyzing data sets or using computational models, surveying, or experimenting, right? So that's really going to support that academic domain. And similarly, if you feel like students need or want, or you should be promoting digital literacy, things like conducting online research or critiquing prior solutions can support you there. And then let's say that like social studies, you're a social studies classroom teacher and like you're trying to meet your standards, but you really also want to do something that's more student-centered and that's problem solving, that's really based in helping the community. You can have them do things, these investigation methods to support social studies standards. And then like there are lots of other connections, right? So I think I made that point already, which is that this is not an exhaustive list. There are going to be some other investigation methods that you or your students or your community think are important or really valuable. And so don't be constrained by the bullet points on this slide necessarily. But I think it's also really interesting as somebody who has tried to do challenge-based learning in a standards environment in science in particular, learning how educators use these investigation methods with students to help them meet learning goals that are already set for them. I think it's a really interesting thing and would love when you submit some of this work, if you can highlight that. I would love to read more about it. So it's just a call to you to think about how can I support more formal learning along with letting students choose their journey too, because the more you can do both, the stronger that this kind of PBL, CBL type learning, the more effective it can be, the more buy-in you can get from people in formal learning environments where you show that students build not only affective skills, but problem-solving skills and academic skills all in one. So just to call out a few more resources before I wrap up my portion of this, we do have the Challenge Builder. So this is a scaffold for you and your students to work within. If you would like, you can download this and you can start thinking about like, well, in the engage phase, what are the things that we're likely to do? In the investigate phase, what's our guiding questions? How are we going to investigate them? Why did we do that? And what did we learn? The other thing to call out specifically is that there is a filled out example for you. So if you want to learn about like what this might look like when you go through the whole process, there's an example on the environmental impact of cities that talks about through the engage, investigate, and act phase. And so you can look at the Challenge Builder and how those theoretical students might have gone through this process and what they could learn. Thanks, folks.